Do you remember that old TV ad?
On your last trip, did you discover what the Earth people eat? They eat a great many of these. They peel them with their metal knives. Boil them for 20 of their minutes. Then they smash them all to bits. They are clearly a most primitive people.
For mash, get smash.
Well, the aliens clearly found the potato business pretty funny. But they soon discovered that Earthlings were not just primitive, but gullible too, because they lived under the illusion that a long-established, democratically elected parliament would automatically act in their common interest. They were totally oblivious that behind this facade it was an unscrupulous group called bankers which really governed their planet. Now, these visitors knew better than to intervene, but they were actually quite a decent bunch. So they arranged for these nasty bankers to self-destruct and give their victims an opportunity to rearrange their affairs more sensibly. That was in 2008 when they took off home, saying, well, if they let that happen again, then they're so stupid they don't deserve to survive. Following the banking meltdown of 2009, a number of economic miracles took place. 1. All laws of commercial gravity were defied as political leaders refinanced the banks with literally trillions of public money, not a penny of which created a solitary asset nor an iota of wealth. 2. The resultant reincarnation revealed an industry virtually untouched by any meaningful reform. And 3. A magic spell was cast, dimming the entire event in the public memory as banking returned to what is widely perceived as normality. Shortly after men gave up trying to make gold from base metal, they transferred their attention to making money from banking. It is in the nature of mankind that in the absence of any restraint, the temptation to make money without actually having to work for it is quite irresistible. In this endeavour they were much more successful, and an obliging if entirely unrepresentative English government quietly slipped through the Tonnage Act in 1697, granting banks the privilege of creating credit, and this has remained technically legal ever since. Of course, there were regulations restricting the unique privilege, and bankers have worked tirelessly ever since to have these restrictions removed in favour of self-regulation. In 1986, Mrs. Thatcher obliged, though not to the extent that banks could actually print money or create credit to spend directly on themselves. But we'll see how they get around this minor irritation very shortly. So the banks expanded rapidly, dealing in financial assets. They called it investment banking. This is the trading floor at UBS, and the scale is phenomenal. But that's a corruption of the word investment, which most of us still understand as raising real money and committing it to a productive business activity, be it a factory, a shop or an office, to provide useful professional services for accountants, lawyers, architects and the like, or for hospitals and schools. But all that's small beer nowadays. So what is investment banking if it has nothing to do with investment? Well, it has little to do with banking either, except that it thrives upon the oxygen of bank credit. That's what finances the billion-dollar deals to buy and sell financial packages, packages which in themselves are packages of financial commitments based on more credit, for example mortgages, loans, commodity and stock options, etc. As these go on and on, being traded on more and more credit terms, a huge inverted pyramid balances precariously on its point. The best of this wheeze is that the so-called bulge bracket banks, those too big to fail conglomerates with a finger in every financial pie, they simply borrow from each other to finance these deals. No one invests in the true sense of the word. No one invests any real money. This is the interbank lending fiasco, which came to an abrupt halt when someone asked Northern Rock for their money back in September 2007.
Well, why did it happen so suddenly?
Because some idiot somewhere asked a question that should never have been asked.
Which was what?
Which was how much are these things worth?
And then the whole thing unravelled.
Yeah, it makes you weep, doesn't it? If they'd have kept quiet, things might have just gone on as they were. Oh, for the good old days.
credit they gamble with was, and is again today, the national credit. That's the same national credit which governments have used to bail out these so-called investment banking commitments when too many went pear-shaped at one time and the perpetual motion credit wheel stopped revolving. The question is not should bankers' bonuses be capped or taxed. It is, are banks abusing their privilege of creating the national credit and thus enabling them to make the excessive profits from which these bonuses are paid, even in times of recession? What's it all for? Why do we allow chartered banks, which are trustees of the national credit, the stuff of overdrafts and consumer credit, to abuse this privilege by providing credit gearing to their subsidiary special investment vehicles, fellow bankers, hedge funds, private equity companies and myriad other financial adventures? They do nothing but inflate a huge asset bubble and endow financial markets with an influence far beyond any economic reality. This is no more than a legalized Ponzi scheme, contributing nothing to society and destabilizing the entire economy. And that prompts the next question. Why on earth were the banks bailed out? But first, look again at the perpetual motion wheel. If Bank A lends to B, etc., around the circular alphabet to Y and Z, and then Z lends to A, etc., as we suggest, there is no real money involved, just bank credit promises of money between banks. Now all credit is a double entry, so if A owes approximately the same as some other bank owes to A, the bulk of the loans comprise a zero-sum game. The only real money is the profit extracted when it is paid out in dividends and bonuses, that's to say, when it enters the real economy. So ask again, why are taxpayers being burdened with all this notional bad debt, which has to be serviced in real money terms by cutbacks and taxation, just to preserve this fantasy world of unconstrained private bank lending? What should have been done was what would happen to any other cartel of private companies which went bust: send in the accountants. If General Motors, employing 250,000 worldwide, can be restructured in this way over a few months, then so could the banks. Overnight, and with the full backing of the law, the accountants would have put any insolvent bank into administration. That's a legal suspension of directors and shareholders, allowing the business to continue under management for as long as the administration shall determine. During that period, the retail banking sector would have been isolated and maintained in ongoing normal business. Deposits and outstanding loans to non-bank customers would have been guaranteed. Other creditors who were owed all the billions of toxic debt, mainly other banks, would have been required to file their claims in the normal way. They wouldn't have got much, but at least we would know the figures and exactly who they were. It might have been pretty dramatic for the money markets, but not for the rest of us. Normal lending would have been continued without a hitch, with the real economy largely unaffected. Instead, generations of taxpayers are saddled with trillions of other people's gambling debts, and the economy crippled. Of course, not everyone sees it in these terms.
Very important we don't alienate the real wealth creators. Yes, we need ordinary, honest men of the soil, nothing wrong with that. Ordinary people doing what ordinary people do. Making things, soft cushions, lettuces, I don't know. What do people do in factories all day? Anyway, ride around on bicycles in cloth caps, calling each other chummy, waiting for the tea trolley to come around. Nothing wrong with that. The great unwashed beavering away, home to a tin bath in front of the fire and a plate of hot ciabatta and dripping. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly fair, perfectly ghastly. But don't let me influence you. No. What we need, every bit as much, only more so, are very, very rich people holding shadowy meetings on Mediterranean yachts, oiling the wheels of the world economy. Little drip here, tiny drop there. You scratch my back, I'll tip off the editor of a national newspaper. Always has been and always will be, and it's my job. Hang on, I have still got one, haven't I? Yes, it's my job, the one Gordon specifically asked me to do, to get stuck in and make sure the papers have a good, old-fashioned story about rich folk on the razzle. To send the message that things are back to normal, to how they've always been, how they always will be. Plus ça change, Please say you'll always love me. Right, everyone back to work. Taxi to Corfu.
Western governments have long treated monetary and banking policy as the purview of the private banking industry and their tame economists, and because of this it has grown into a monster. We argue today that this is a constitutional priority for the whole of society. You know, we're not just being taken to the cleaners by these guys, we're meekly queuing up outside to get fleeced. Given the political will, it would not be difficult to reinstate the former legislation ditched in the United Kingdom in 1986 and in the US in 1999 with the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act. Why has this not been done? Well, mainly because too many people still believe the bankers know best, and because we no longer have statesmen, just puppet politicians manipulated by unelected lobbyists. Listen to Franklin D. Roosevelt proclaiming the New Deal in 1933, and compare that with Gordon Brown and Company today.
There must be an end to speculation with other people's money.
And while there has been irresponsibility, we must now say clearly,
there must be a strict supervision of all banking and credits and investments.
and we must now build that new global financial order.
And there must be provision for an adequate but sound currency.
The banking gravy train started from the City of London a long time ago. America joined in when the Federal Reserve took over their treasury. The European Union was a late starter, but made up for lost time with the ill-conceived single currency experiment. Nations which allow their currencies to become the stuff of big business rather than a neutral facilitator for exchanging goods and services pay a heavy price for this corruption in terms of their economic sovereignty. In January 2010, President Obama announced his initiative on banking reform, and the world hoped he could make it happen.
Banks will no longer be allowed to own, invest, or sponsor hedge funds, private equity funds, or proprietary trading operations for their own profit, unrelated to serving their country. But these firms should not be allowed to run these hedge funds and private equities funds while running a bank backed by the American people. And my message to leaders of the financial industry is to work with us and not against us on needed reforms. I welcome constructive input from folks in the financial sector, but what we've seen so far in recent weeks is an army of industry lobbyists from Wall Street descending on Capitol Hill to try and block basic and common sense rules of the road that would protect our economy and the American people. So, if these folks want a fight, it's a fight I'm ready to have. And my resolve is only strengthened when I see a return to old practices at some of the very firms fighting reform. When I see soaring profits and obscene bonuses at some of the very firms claiming that they can't lend more to small businesses, they can't keep credit card rates low, they can't pay a fee to refund taxpayers for the bailout without passing on the cost to shareholders or customers. That's the claims they're making. It's exactly this kind of irresponsibility that makes clear reform is necessary. Now, we've come through a terrible crisis. The American people have paid a very high price. We simply cannot return to business as usual.
He quickly found himself saddled with the obligatory Treasury Secretary from Goldman Sachs and a Congress where the powerful banking lobby dominates the few remaining shreds of that splendid Constitution. And so it was yes to bailouts, more debt and deception, but no to reform, and so it was to be. To understand the hustle, watch Part 2. See how the banks inflate the money supply, take their bonuses and leave you with the bill. And if you'd like to know how to drive them out of town, don't miss the concluding Part 3.